Homer wrote about the Trojan War around 4 centuries after it was supposed to have happened. So explain this one to me. How do we have paperwork about it? Actual paperwork, filed while it was still going on, by people who weren't even Greek. Because we do. Around 3,000 years ago, the Hittite Empire kept a vast archive at its capital, Hattusa, roughly 30,000 clay tablets, letters and treaties, and administrative records, written down while the late Bronze Age was actually happening. That is the thing that makes this different. It is a contemporary, outside window on Western Anatolia, set down while events were unfolding, unlike Homer, who put it all into verse about 4 centuries later. These were bureaucrats, not bards. They were not trying to entertain anyone. They were keeping score, and that is exactly why their scorekeeping is worth so much to us. So here is the single question this whole investigation turns on. Forget the myth for a moment. Is there a contemporary receipt, a real document, from someone with no stake in Homer's story for a war over Troy? Last time, we left the crime scene with no suspect. Archaeologists found a real city on that hill, and a layer where it burned around the 12th century BC, but nobody could say who lit the fire. And that is the wall this investigation keeps hitting. The trowel can dig up ash and fallen walls, but ash does not sign its name. The excavations did reveal a substantial city, a large lower town with a rock-cut defensive ditch beyond the citadel. And the layer we labeled Troy 7A was destroyed by fire around 1180 BC, with traces consistent with the siege, but no text names who burned it. And Homer is no help here, writing centuries later, his version full of gods and heroes. Unless someone else was writing things down at the time. And someone was. Start with 2 names, because 2 names crack the whole map open. The first is Wilusa. In the Hittite texts, Wilusa is almost certainly the place Homer would later call Ilios, or Troy. And I want to be careful with that word almost, because this is the majority scholarly view, not a certainty, and it is not regarded as beyond question. What anchors it is geography. In 1998, the scholar Hawkins read a rock relief at Karabel and fixed a political map of Western Anatolia, and that map puts Wilusa up in the Troad in the northwest, where Hizarlik is the only major late Bronze Age city. Get the map right, and suddenly the name stops looking like a coincidence. The second name is Ahhiyawa. In those same records, Ahhiyawa almost certainly refers to the Mycenaean Greek world, the Achaeans of Homer. And again, careful, it is widely accepted but not beyond question. Farr first proposed the link back in 1924. It was attacked for decades, and it only really settled after new readings and Mycenaean finds along the West Anatolian coast. And here's the part that stopped me cold. The Hittites treated Ahhiyawa as a great power, on a par with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. In one letter, the Hittite king actually calls the Ahhiyawan king his brother. In another treaty, a scribe literally struck the king of Ahhiyawa out of a list of great kings, which tells you the status was real, but it rose and fell. So the Greeks are not ghosts in this archive. They're named players seated at the top table. Hold on to that, because it changes how we read everything that follows. Now the documents themselves. Around 1280 BC, the Hittite great king Muwatalli II signed a vassal treaty with a man named Alaksandu, king of Wilusa. Read that back slowly. A named king of Troy in a formal treaty a full century before the city burned. This is not a mythic city anymore. It is a kingdom with a leader and a diplomatic file. And the names inside that file do something to the back of your neck. Alaksandu strikingly echoes the Greek name Alexandros, which just happens to be the other name of Paris in the Iliad. I will say this one plainly, because it is so easy to get wrong. That is a resemblance of names, not proof that this king was Paris, and the name might simply be Anatolian or Luwian. The treaty even names a divine witness, Apollonius, widely read as an early form of Apollo, the very god who defends Troy in the poem. Popular, plausible, and still debated. An echo, not an identity. So park both of those in the maybe column. and keep moving because the strongest evidence is not in the names at all. Then there's the letter everybody wants to be a smoking gun. It is called the Tawagalawa letter, written around 1250 BC. It contains one line. The line most scholars read as, "Now that we have reached an agreement on the matter of Wilusa, over which we went to war." And you can feel the pull of that sentence. But here is the discipline the evidence demands. The referent of that phrase, "what we went to war," actually points to, is itself contested among scholars. It is a disputed reading, not a verbatim confession of the Trojan War. What the letter does show, cleanly, is that its writer addressed the Greek king as a diplomatic equal, as a brother. So it is solid evidence of contact and friction. A signed confession of the Trojan War, it is not, and the friction was real out on the ground. Milawata, which is Miletus, was an Ahhiyawan foothold on the Anatolian coast, and a Greek-backed warlord named Piamdu raided Hittite territory, including Lasba, the island of Lesbos. That is documented in the Tawagalawa and Manapatar letters, and it hands us a real theater and a real motive for repeated Greek-Anatolian friction. This is Greeks operating out of a coastal base, making trouble again and again. This is the ordinary, grinding texture the epic leaves out. One more document. The Milawata letter names Walmu, a king of Wilusa who had been deposed, and whom the Hittite king wanted put back on his throne. So Wilusa is still a working vassal kingdom, with its own dynastic politics into the later 13th century BC. The city is not just real. It has generations of kings, which brings us straight to the trap I promised we would not fall into. The Alaksandu Treaty is around 1280 BC. The burning of Troy 7a is around 1180 BC. Those two are separated by roughly a century, several reigns. The king who signed that treaty is not the king of the city that burned, and the two of them must never be treated as the same man. And that gap is the clue to the whole case. Because here is what the Hittite records do not describe: a Homeric Trojan War. There is no Helen, no Agamemnon, no 10-year siege, no wooden horse. What they show instead is episodic friction over Wilusa, spread across roughly 2 centuries, flare-ups, raids, treaties, and more flare-ups. This was never one war. It looks like Homer took a long, messy, 200-year border saga and compressed it into a single 10-year legend. Read that way, the myth is not a lie. It is a compression. So let us be honest about what we are actually holding. We can prove the place, Wilusa, almost certainly Troy. We can prove the players, Ahhiyawa, almost certainly the Mycenaean Greeks. And we can prove real, repeated conflict over that city, corroborated by an outside party with no stake whatsoever in Homer. And that is not nothing. For a 3,000-year-old question, being able to prove the place, the players, and the fighting is a remarkable amount. What we cannot prove is the myth. No Helen, no wooden horse, no single, tidy 10-year siege, and no text, not one, names who burned the city around 1180 BC. And this is exactly where a good historian keeps you honest. Trevor Bryce cautions that the surviving material does not, on its own, prove there was an actual Trojan War, and he puts it better than I can: the less material one has, the more easily it can be manipulated to fit whatever conclusion one wishes. So the verdict is a qualified yes. A real place, real players, real, recurring war over the city we call Troy, filed away in an enemy's archive. Just not the war Homer's saying. But that leaves one last question, and it is the one that opens the next chapter. If the kingdom was real, and the great powers were real, and the fighting was real, then what destroyed the entire world that fought over it? That is where we go next.